audiences. We're going to sort of set the stage of why this tool wound up being built, and then we'll walk you through how it was built and then give you a demonstration of this tool. Next slide. So the University System of Georgia is a system of public four-year institutions governed by the Board of Regents. We have 26 institutions organized into 4 sectors of institutions based on selectivity and balance of the research and teaching mission. So 4 research institutions like the University of Georgia, Georgia Tech, Georgia State, 4 comprehensive or regional universities like Georgia Southern and Kennesaw State universities, 9 state universities, which are generally smaller with a more regional catchment area. And one of those is our home NISTS institution, University of North Georgia. And 9 state colleges that are small, draw more locally for enrollment, and offer both 2- and 4-year degree programs. State colleges are largely open access and serve the access mission for the system. The USG is explicitly designed to support transfer as a means of student access and success. There's a system-wide general education curriculum that guarantees transferability of completed general education components. And we also have an agreement with our sister technical college system that's set to accept a set of 29 general education courses. Advance the slide, please. Like a lot of campus and system reporting, we have traditionally focused more on first-time students than transfer students, but that has changed over time. We have supported the system transfer function in a number of ways. We produce annual snapshot reports on volume of transfer into and out of our institutions and other sectors. For example, the TCSG system I mentioned. These include information on average GPAs and hours earned before transfer and then 1 year after transfer between each pair of sending and receiving institutions or sending and receiving sectors. We supplement this with student level files we provide to the campus IR shops for campuses they can understand for students who transfer out, where they go, what their academic performance is after that, and what their major is. We also have reports showing completion rates of transfer students at their new institutions. All this helps campus both on the sending and receiving end assess their success in supporting transfer students. We also conduct more ad hoc in-depth transfer analyses for requesting institutions. But all this work historically has been more traditional, static, tabular reporting, and it takes a fair amount of work for a campus personnel to draw conclusions from that proliferation of static point-in-time reports. Next slide, cue up the partnership. Several years back, the University System of Georgia began partnering with the Carl Vinson Institute of Government to find better ways to use the data collected from our system campuses to inform campus decision-making, planning, and student success outcomes. We collect a lot of campus data, but it wasn't being optimized for supporting these campus functions in ways that we would have liked in system office decision-making. So this partnership benefits from the Carl Vinson Institute, which is a public institute at the University of Georgia that supports government, and it is interdisciplinary, which helps us tremendously in our work with them. They have both an internal and external perspective on the issues that they address. And they also have, importantly for the presentation today, strong teams of data science and analysts and a fair amount of data visualization infrastructure already in place that supports the work that we have done together. And as we've developed tools, next slide, to surface back to campus, we ultimately developed a secure data portal through which campuses access the tools or apps that we've collaborated to build. And all the institutions have access to these apps. They're built in the Qlik data visualization software, and they've focused so far on enrollment management type of applications and academic program monitoring and planning applications. And the student transfer, when you're going to see today, will be added to this portal very soon. So you're getting an advanced view of this tool. Okay, I'm going to turn it over now to my colleagues at the Carl Vinson Institute. We're thrilled to partner with them. They do a fabulous job, and you're going to really enjoy what you learn about today. Thanks.
Thanks, Angie. I'm David Tanner with the Carl Vinson Institute of Government. It's a pleasure to be with you. One of the things we like to do in our sessions like this, especially virtual, is get to know our audience a little better. So we are going to use Slido. And if you have another browser window, you can open up to slido.com and type in #UGA.0223. And we will ask you a few questions to get to know our audience today. So if you want to use the QR code, you can use your camera on your phone, or you can go to this browser and let us know kind of what area of higher education you primarily work in. So just open up another tab in your browser and go to slido.com and do pound UGA 0223. So we know we have about 30 people roughly on our in the audience today. So love to hear where you're from. If you're having trouble with Slido, go ahead and just type it in the chat, kind of what particular area you work in. So for the responses we have so far, a good mix of folks in student advisement, academic affairs, and then a lot of folks in other. So good. I'd love to hear in the chat. You can also tell us kind of where you work. All right, let's go to the next one, Scott. So one of the things we like to know is, what are some burning questions you have about transfer students? We can actually tailor a little bit of our presentation today based on the questions you pose. So this makes it kind of interactive. So what are some key questions you might have about transfer students, whether it's at your own institution or in your region of the country or in your university system? What do you wish you knew that you don't know? Everyone's good. You've read the research. We're all good. Well, I'll tell you, one of the questions we get a lot when we talk about transfer students is, who's transferring away from my institution and what major are they in and what are they completing their studies in? So how to attract students participating in Articulate, so that the students who are part of your partner agent institutions when it comes to articulation agreements, that's a good one. Who's part of those schools and who's not? Good. All right, are there emerging student mobility pathways you see in the data? How do we track? Now we're cooking. So interesting, a lot. Someone here would like to know where do students come from and what institution they attend previously? How many come from the same program they're in at their previous institution? Are there emerging student mobility pathways? Okay, this is great. I think, as we get more data, we also can ask new questions. And I think at the end of our presentation, we'll be really curious what other new questions you might have based on what can be done with some of the Clearinghouse data as we knit together a longitudinal database view of it. All right. So we are going to present our analytics work based on the National Student Clearinghouse data, and it is a great resource. What we're curious, though, those who've worked with National Student Clearinghouse data, what are some of your frustrations, or maybe not even frustrations, just challenges that you have in working with this kind of data? So limited access on your campus. That's a good point. How do you get this information out to all the people who really need to know what's going on with student mobility and transfer students? This data can be very complex, absolutely. And some of the fields aren't very clear. There's always formatting. Yep. So clearly from what we've seen, so how do you make the data clean and make it accessible? I definitely see a theme already in some of your information. How do you capture dual enrollment students? That's a good question. Not sure where to get started. Difficult to sort and search. Okay. Well, hopefully today's presentation on the work we've been doing, and I'll just say the work that Scott King is going to present today and James Byars is managing the Q&A in the chat, comes from a lot of years of work to try and get our hands around how to put together a longitudinal database of transfer student information from the Clearinghouse and then present it in a way that helps us understand student mobility in new ways. You know, y'all are experts in transfer student work, not to beat the drum too much, but we do know a good bit from the literature about transfer students that they are a significant portion in institutional enrollments, especially in certain institutions, and that rates of transfer from community colleges to four-year schools are higher. Something that during the pandemic, the upward transfer mobility has been less affected by the pandemic than other pathways. So people are still trying to move from maybe a two-year school to a four-year, or from a four-year to a research. And that pattern hasn't really changed since the pandemic. So one of the things we're interested in sharing with you today is how we've looked at student transfer patterns. And that is students who are moving from one institution to another. What are those characteristics? And what are some prominent pathways between their institution and other institutions? So what are some of the characteristics of these students? What are some of the prominent pathways? And a common question we get is, where students are transferring to, what credential are they earning? And is that degree offered in my institution where they left? We think that the way we've organized this can help answer some of these questions. So I'm going to turn it now to Scott King, who's our lead data scientist on this application, and he'll walk you through some of the work that was done to prepare the data and then show you examples of how this data can be used to answer questions about student flows, student transfer patterns, et cetera. Scott?
Thanks, David. So our data set in particular comes from the National Student Clearinghouse, and it consists of every USG student that matriculated into that university system of Georgia, any of those schools between the years 2011 and 2020. We use this data set to build the application that we're going to demo for you guys today. The data is truncated, so we looked at all of the enrollment flows of those students within the Clearinghouse. We stopped it after the student earns the first baccalaureate completion, if they do earn the first baccalaureate completion. Student mobility then becomes very clear as a view to us, and that's for mobility of students, how they move within the university system of Georgia, as well as to other schools, because after the student attends a university system of Georgia school, they could move to a school at the national level or a tech school or any school outside of that. Some of the work that we do within our partnership between the USG and the CVIOG is geocoding of institutions. So we do a lot of that for some of our other applications and tools and offerings within our portal. And we utilized some of that information, pulled it into this app, and joined it with this National Student Clearinghouse data to see geographic relationships between these institutions where possible. And in addition to that, we use some of the other data from the National Center for Education Statistics to classify institutions based on their Carnegie classification. David mentioned, and there was some response in the Slido poll about how messy clearinghouse data can be. So we had to address some of the problems that we saw within the clearinghouse. One of those areas was degree names. So we utilize our knowledge of data science, and we're continuing to use our team's knowledge of data science to improve our processes and methodologies in trying to classify degree names into degree types. So taking the actual names that are listed in the clearinghouse data and converting them into things like baccalaureate level degrees by CIP code. In addition to problems there, not every school is on a semester system, so we have to do a lot of conversion, enrollment, and graduation dates into things like semesters and terms, so we can stay consistent in terms of how we're looking at timing within these enrollment patterns. And then lastly, we found some issues with satellite branches and between schools that eventually consolidated within the university system of Georgia. There were data points where students would have earned their degree from a main campus, even though their entire enrollment was at a satellite campus. And similar problems exist with consolidated institutions. So to deal with that, we rolled up all of the data so that every institution reports to its main campus or its final consolidated institution name. And like I said, we're continuing to improve and incorporate more efficient data science strategies to process this clearinghouse data. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. So I wish that all transfer patterns were this simple, but this is an example of a simple transfer pattern of the student. They flow from one institution to the next, and each institution is a different institution in their flow. This is what represents a simple institutional flow. So each arrow here could be some form of transition for the student. They could have earned a degree as they move from institution 1 to institution 2. In our case, that can only be an under baccalaureate completion, so an associate's degree, or some sort of certificate if it's from a tech school. The arrow could also be an officially coded withdrawal. Those happen in Clearinghouse data, and where they are, we try to account for them within these flows. And then lastly, that transition could just be a movement from one institution to a different institution without a completion. This is what we're mostly interested in. Those are the transfers that we're going to refer to. So when we refer to transfer in the tool and in our presentation here today, that's what we're talking about. Moves between one institution to a different institution without a completion along the way. Specific institutions, they usually generate requests and areas of concern about where their students are coming from, and then where they're headed after they do leave in this pattern without a completion. They do leave the institution and go on to another institution. They want to know where those students goes and what kind of outcomes they have along the way. Those are the most popular 2 questions, and we saw some of that in the Slido poll as well. So to analyze this in the best way possible, we break down flows like this, and all the flows will exist like this. We could outline them, even as complicated as they are, in a diagram like this. And we're going to break these down into what I call groups of 3 analysis. This groups of 3 analysis looks at each step in the transition process for the student. So we look at them as a first-time matriculant who into a USG school, and then as they move on from that USG school to the next institution that they would attend, we look at them as if they're entering students into that 3rd institution or that 2nd institution, and then as they move on to a 3rd, and we just break down each possible part of that pathway into these groups of 3 analysis. If we do this for every single possible pathway for all the students in our data set, and then we restrict that center grouping in schools to our institutions of interest, which is in this case the University System of Georgia, we end up with a pretty clear picture about how students are coming in, flowing through USG, and then onward to other schools. Once those institutions of interest are identified, we can aggregate this data and then put it into our BI software, which in this case is Qlik, and we'll show a demo of that later. Now, there are significant institutional flows of interest from one institution to the next. We can identify those partnerships in that way. And then we can also talk about how the students are entering. So if they're coming in with credentials or not, if they're coming in as transfer students, and then how they're leaving, if they're leaving with a credential or if they're moving on. And then once they get to that last institution, we can look at their outcomes there as well with the Clearinghouse data. Now, I've been to a few talks this morning at the conference, and an overarching theme I'd say is that transfers are not always so simple as that first slide would make it out to be. They don't always go from one institution to the next. Sometimes they swirl, sometimes they come back to an original institution, and this is an example of such a complex flow for a student. So this institution started at one institution, they transferred away to another institution before returning back to their original matriculation institution. In this example, we refer to this as a swirl in the literature. And then undergraduates often take summer courses. Those students would be classified as transient students. This is not really a transition. We don't want to consider that in the transfers. And then, but we still would break this down in the same way that we broke down that first simplified flow in the groups of 3 way. And when we do that, as we look at the student as they come in as a first-time enrollee to the first institution, we also will catch them again in that 3rd row here. So you'll notice 2 of these are highlighted in red. They entered that first institution twice. It's a duplicated count. So they come in first as a first-time enrollee, and they come in the second time as a student moving in some form of transition, whether it be a completion or a transfer from institution 2 to institution 1 again. This duplication is something that we have to deal with, and it makes the data really complex. And it also makes us have to acknowledge that what we're counting in terms of this data tool that we're going to demo is pathways and not students. So you'll notice that my language shifts here. Complex institutional flows are not even always that nice. That was actually a really nice version of a complex institutional flow. In some instances, students can be, one other thing we have to acknowledge about Clearinghouse data is, or about student mobility in general, is that they can have multiple enrollment records at an institution within the same term. So you could be enrolled at 2 schools at the same time and have co-enrollment that exists. You can also earn multiple degrees within the same semester. So at UGA, we call those double dogs. I'm sure you guys have similar nomenclature for people to earn multiple degrees within the same semester at your institutions. And then this causes the duplication pathway. We had to figure out how we were going to address these sort of complications to try to keep the tool as simple as we possibly could. So to address complex pathways for the tool as it sits now, we did an analysis on how many of those pathways ended up being that way. And in terms of students that ended up being co-enrolled or had multiple degrees within the same semester, that ended up being only about 12% of the pathways that we were looking at. So we decided to remove those pathways to keep the tool as simple as possible. Some student pathways also showed extreme mobility. We removed those as well. I think our cutoff for the current version of the application was 19 different transitions, just to give you some idea of how high the student mobility was in some of those cases. So higher than 19 transitions students were not included, their pathways were excluded. Now, when we talk about big data and data like this, I like to analogize it to a donut. This is not my analogy. Somebody else came up with this, and I'm very appreciative of it, though, because it's a very nice way to think about this. So the final process version of our data is not a complete record of all of the data for all the students that matriculated into the system during that time period, but it is a representative sample of all the students that didn't have any form of co-enrollment. So one of the things that we like to do here is, when we make emphasis on the data, we can't really focus on the things that we don't have information on. We do need to focus on the things that are there. We do have a representative sample of students that took clear convergent pathways through the university system of Georgia. So we need to be mindful of that while we make emphasis with data. And we need to focus on the donut, the data that we do have, and not the hole in the donut, which is the missing data. So what can we learn from this data? Well, we have all of the individual pathways for students that were in the NSC data set that took clear convergent pathways from one institution to the next in the state of Georgia. Even that first complex example that I gave where a student swirled, those students are in there. We can use those pathways, aggregate them, and count them how they flow between different students, specifically measuring the proportional magnitude, so the percentage of those counts as they move from one institution to the next. And then we can use those counts to understand how students are flowing from one institution to the other. And because we've attached degree information to this, we can also talk about what kind of outcomes they had along the way, and if they earned a degree, what kind of degree they earned. And one of the things that I want you guys to be mindful of as we move into presenting about the tool is this color choice coding that we've made here. So the colors in this graphic are consistent with the coloring in the app that we're going to demo for you guys. Anything that's in the color on the left, which I'll refer to as green, that consists of data that comes from a previous institution. Anything that's in the color of the thing in the center here, that's our institutions of interest. In this case, those are only USG schools. So those are the outcomes and degrees, things that happen at the USG schools. And then the color on the right, which I'll refer to as orange, that's what happened at the next institution for the students as they flow. We're going to show you one quick visual that we generated, and then we're going to move into a demo here. So utilizing this tool, aggregating it, putting it into our BI platform Qlik, we were able to create some neat visualizations. This is one such visualization. This is a diverging bar chart. Each of the bars in this chart represents 100% of the data for a specific institution within the USG. So there's 26 different institutions. And what we've done here is we've made the outcomes here for the pathways that those institutions diverge. And they diverge in two directions, a positive and a negative direction. And we coded these as follows. So the light blue color on the right, that's in the positive direction. That's a student that graduated. This teal color here, that's a student that's still enrolled at those institutions. These two colors on the end are students that transferred. Those students either transferred and are still enrolled or still graduated at the next institution that they attended. So we identified all of those as positive outcomes. The ones to the left of 0 are negative outcomes for those students. So those are students that are going to show no more enrollment history after a certain point. They did not continue. And students that transferred and then subsequently dropped out, and then lastly withdrew. This gives you a quick system-wide glance at how the institutions are doing in terms of these outcomes, which ones are having the most positive and most negative, because each one of these bars is going to add up to 100%, even though some of them are shown in the graphic as being negative outcomes. At this point, I'm going to bring up my tool. So this is one of the dashboards that we created within the tool. I mentioned that we did some geocoding of different addresses. Qlik Sense is our BI platform of choice here that we're going to use and talk about how we developed all our different dashboards. You'll notice the color coding that I mentioned before, and how it's consistent with this graphic. So on the left here, we've got a bar chart for schools that are feeding students into a particular institution, and on the right, we've got students that are leaving. If I pick on a particular institution, we've done a lot of work with Georgia Burnett, so I'm going to pick on Georgia Burnett. One of the powerful things about BI platforms is it allows us to present dynamic views of data, so we can filter to a specific school, and that's how this visual works. So what happens is I select one of our institutions of interest, which is Georgia Burnett College, it's a USG school, is the geographic image, the map in the center of this visualization populates, and this shows you where Georgia Burnett is in this instance, and the top 5 schools that they share students with. So those green arrows in that visual in the center, that's where their students are coming from in this data set, and the orange arrows are where their students are leaving and moving on to other institutions at within the national landscape. So if they needed a more detailed view of this stuff, we've got some different slides later that we can present this on, but this gives them a nice geographic idea of where their closest partners are in terms of how many students they're sharing between them. And you can do this for any institution within the USG. I'm going to clear this. I'm going to move on to the next visual within the application. So we've got several different dashboards that we're going to talk about today. This set of bar charts in particular deals with institutional outcomes as a student moves along in the groupings of 3 analysis way that we've laid out the data here. So as a student enters the USG, they come in with either known previous institutional experience, they're first-time matriculant. They come in as a transfer student, so they come in with prior institutional experience, but without a completion. They could come in as having graduated, or they can come in as having withdrawn officially from a prior institution, with a small percentage of those students coming in that way. We can see the outcomes of the students while they're within USG, and then we can look at the outcomes for the next attended institutions. Now, another way that we could utilize filters and do further analysis on this data set is we can toggle through different outcomes to filter the pathways that are of a certain type. So if we were interested in students that are coming in with a credential, for instance, students that enter USG institutions having a completion at a prior institution, then we can look at the outcomes and how those differ. You might have missed that, so I'll do it again really fast. Let's see how the top outcomes here right now are transferred and graduated. If I select just graduated, we can see that those students, the vast majority of their pathways end in graduation at USG schools. With the second most popular here being still enrolled students. They're being very successful. If they come in with a prior credential, they're carrying that momentum in the terms of those pathways from one institution to the next. And remember, this is national data, so this is a credential from any school, not just other USG institutions. It could be a completion from a tech school as well. We can also focus in on students that are moving. Most popular questions that we get about where students are moving away from USG schools if they're not earning a completion. And I can do that by selecting the students that had the outcome of transfer at a USG school. So if I look at the students that had an outcome of transfer at a USG school, I can see their outcomes at the next awarded institution for the most part. Remember, this is aggregated data for almost 10 years worth of students. I'm going to stop here and see if anybody has a question.
You're also welcome to unmute if you'd like to ask a question or put your questions in the chat. I know this is a lot of information all at once, so please let us know if you have any questions.
So remember, this is a dynamic tool. We can use it to analyze things as they happen at the system level, but it's intended to be used for a specific institution of interest. So since we're being hosted by the University of North Georgia for NISTS, we might pick on North Georgia here for a minute. And what we'll look at is their transfer students, and what you can see in the outcomes of the next institution for students that matriculated into or transferred into University of North Georgia and then left North Georgia to move on to another institution is that they're more likely to graduate at the very next institution that they attended. So their transfer students are very successful in the next stop. These outcomes vary like this for the different institutions within the USG, and our particular stakeholders can go into these tools and they can select themselves and see how these outcomes differ for them along the way. I'm going to clear my filters now. I'm going to move on to the next two sheets within the app. Now, these two sheets within the app, they deal with how students are coming into the institution and how students are leaving institution. We've seen some visualizations deal around this prior to now, but this is an extremely detailed view for these students that are coming into these places. So there are two sheets like this. This one deals with post-institution of experience. So this is what happens to the student after they leave our institutions of interest. Where are they moving on to? What kind of degrees are they earning once they get there, if they're earning a degree? We also have one that goes pairwise with this one that deals with prior institution experience. So we could see the trends for how students are entering a particular institution of interest as well as their outcomes at that institution of interest as well. But we're going to focus on this one. They kind of mirror each other. So schools in particular might be interested in the amount of students that are transferring away, as I mentioned before. That's one of the most popular things that we get. So we could focus particularly on that population by selecting it in the bar chart. Students that are transferring out of the University System of Georgia, most common question we get is where do they go? Well, in terms of what kind of system they're transferring into, over here in the top right, we've mapped out what percentage of pathways end up back in the USG, what percentage end up in the TCSG, which is an acronym that stands for the Technical College System of Georgia. So this is students that transferred into tech schools, and then other. So those are schools that don't fall within these two categories. So neither USG nor TCSG. If you want to know specifics about your institution, you could filter to it. And then you could hit the tab here at the top. And what we have is a full breakdown of all of the institutions that those students are transferring into. I'm going to blow this up just and scroll through it a second to give you an idea. So this is all the amount, all the pathways that we have that lead to different institutions. And you can see this is not just limited to Georgia. These institutions are from outside the state. So any institution within a national, within the National Student Clearinghouse data set. But using the proportions of these, we can see how many students or which schools have the highest relationship. Now, if I'm interested in students that are moving on and they're attaining a degree at that next level, particularly if they didn't obtain a degree from our institution, I can focus on particular outcomes for those students. So I can focus on the students that graduate. And if I limit the data set to students that graduate after transferring, I could focus on the degree level that they're earning at that next institution. We've got a list of those institutions that they're graduating from. And then if I tab over again, I have a full breakdown of the level of the degree that they're earning and the subject area of the degree. And again, this is an exhaustive list. So it's a very, very large chart here. That has a lot of data in it. But the proportional magnitude here gives us an idea of what kind of degree students are moving into from these schools into other schools. I'm not limited in this tool to just looking at students that transfer. I can also look, if I'm an institution that offers lower than baccalaureate level degrees, I can look at the students that are leaving while earning an under baccalaureate credit along the way. So if I graduate from a USG institution with an under baccalaureate completion, I can see the outcomes here at the bottom left of those students, and you can see the vast majority of them move on, and their pathway ends in graduation at that next stop. And if it ends in graduation at that next stop, I could look at the institutions that they attended in full detail, as well as the degree level and subject area of the degree at the next stop. So that's an example of how we could get detailed information about where our students are going, what kind of degrees they're earning along the way. One of the things I like to do is consider the full pathways of these students, though. And the next two sheets that I'd like to show you guys deals with that, visualizing the pathways of the students as they move towards a completion through the entire path that they can take. These two sheets go hand in hand, and there are two visuals. There are going to be two Sankey diagrams that are mirrored around a particular node. Sankey diagrams are really great at visualizing flows. And in this case, we have flows about stuff that happened in the previous institution into the flows in the color on the right here that deal with what's happening at USG schools. If I click this arrow here, we're now moving from those USG schools into those next schools, so we can visualize a full flow from start to finish and how it looks for particular pathways of students. Sankey diagrams can be a bit complicated. Each one of these lines here are called nodes within the visual. And the reason we did two pairwise here is because our visualization platform is limited to 5 nodes. So we can go back and forth between the two to give a full picture of what's happening. But one of the things that can happen from time to time is people might be interested in students that move on from their institution to obtain a degree in a specific field. Now, we pulled in all of this information and we have turned it into filters within the tool itself. So I could filter to specific degrees at next attended institutions. So if I was interested in what pathways of students look like that come through USG and then move on to a school where they get a degree in engineering, I could look at that within this. I'm going to blow up this filter pane here. And I have categorical ways to select a lot of different things about the next attended institution, but we're interested in the subject area of that next earned degree. In particular, engineering students that are moving on from one of the USG institutions to obtain a degree in engineering. I start typing that, I hit enter, and now I filter to all of those pathways for students that are obtaining some form of degree in engineering as they move through USG. We can see the institutions that they are attending to earn their degree in engineering. We can see how they move from USG to those institutions. You see the majority of those people are transferring. We can see which institutions they attended in USG and then how they entered those institutions for the most part. Most of them entered as first-time matriculant into one of these schools. They transferred away to earn that degree in engineering. So this allows us to gain detailed insights into how students are flowing from institution to institution, what outcomes they're early along the way to get them towards their degree eventually. And we know that those transitions are important for some of those students. I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions.
We do have about 10 minutes left to finish up.
I've got, I want to talk about how we're going to improve the tool in the future, but I wanted to make sure there were no questions before moving on.
There's a question about what system, data system we're using. What's the platform?
This is Qlik. So Qlik is our BI platform. We try to be as agnostic as we can, but Qlik is our platform that we're using for this tool.
Yeah, I can't emphasize enough how much work was done behind the scenes to get to the place where we could actually visualize this data in kind of that I think kind of the breakthrough, Scott, was the thinking about it in 3 nodes, the transfer nodes, 1, 2, 3, and then aligning those. Is there any other kind of thoughts you have about what are some other key kind of things that helped us get to this point in cleaning and organizing the data?
Just our team. Our team's just phenomenal, and they're amazing at handling all the different problems that came up within the clearinghouse data, and there were a multitude of them. And cleaning that data, analyzing it, and getting it ready for a tool like this was just a ton of work that the tool almost doesn't do justice because it so nicely presents it.
And certainly James Byars, who's here answering questions in the chat, he's one of the key data architects that helped get this data set configured and ready so it could be visualized. So I want to also acknowledge him and thank him for his great work. So one of the things we see here, how long did this project take? We started working on this about 4 years ago, and it's taken that much time just to get our hands around how to think about visualizing it, but also wrangling the data to get it formatted in a way that our BI tool could take it in and then generate the visuals we have. I think Scott's also done a lot of work to try and figure out how to keep it simple. And that diverging bar chart was a great example of taking a lot of data and presenting it in a simple way. So Connie, I think UGA particularly hasn't used this data to change its recruiting practices, but we are rolling this out, actually, as Angie said. You're getting a preview. This tool is rolling out as we speak, and so folks have to actually go through a training program to be able to use this tool since it's fairly complex. And so it's just actually this month getting into the hands of institutional research offices and others on our USG institution campuses. Scott, why don't you just wrap up by talking about what we're thinking about for enhancements in the future?
Yeah, so we're always trying to improve and make our tools the best we possibly can to try to help our stakeholders as much as possible. One of the things that we've heard a lot about is longitudinal view. So we recognize that students aren't monoliths and things change over time. So one of the things we want to incorporate into a tool like this is a cohort breakdown so that we can see if these trends hold across years. We're always trying to stay on the cutting edge of data science too. So we're trying to automate as much as we can, use different machine learning techniques that can extract, transform, and load all of the data into the tool in an automated fashion, driven by our subject matter expertise team. And lastly, we would like to incorporate additional data. So one of the things we hear a lot is that people want to study demographics and progression data. They want stuff like credit hour accumulation, GPA, so they can study how those fit into these patterns and thus have more robust analysis on things that they could do. And we're open to suggesting on any other ideas that you guys have if we've unlocked some ideas for you. And if, again, I encourage you to ask questions. We would love to answer them. And if you can't, this is a lot of information. So if you're feeling kind of overwhelmed by all of this, you could always shoot us an email. My email is listed on the slide, as well as David and James and Angie's about this tool and this analysis.
Okay, so we have a couple minutes left for questions. So if anybody has any last minute questions they want to put in the chat.
James, anything you want to add on the technical side before we wrap up?
It's just an interesting challenge. Clearinghouse provides a great window into student mobility. It just takes a little bit of extra oomph to put it into meaningful data intelligence. So
I'll tell you that when we've shared this in our training programs, immediately people are asking for adding additional data, as Scott mentioned, credit hour data, grade data, demographic data, and that'll be coming. But I think they're all amazed at how many people, the transfer relationships they have that they didn't realize they had. And that certainly comes out in some of the visuals that we've prepared. You can see those connections of who's cycling through a research institution to a two-year college, back to a research institution, and so forth. So, and really think about those agents, those schools that they have a transfer relationship with that they may have not realized. So turn it to Angie to close us out.
I just want to echo some of the comments in the chat. I did not build this, so I feel like I can brag and boast and say how wonderful it is what the Carl Vinson folks have built. They really have, as I said, it's taken a long time, but now they are willing, have learned a lot along the way, and we are willing to share some of this learning with you. So if you want to build something similar, please reach out. We would love to have conversations about how you might want to do something similar. I think that's about all that I had to offer. It's just a great collaboration we have. And another thing, maybe a takeaway from this project is looking to find the sort of public institutes at your campus or other entities or centers in your campus that might have this same interdisciplinary approach to attacking intransigent problems, whether it be for institutions or other type of external entities, but they have the same sets of skills that could be leveraged to do this kind of work. And those types of partnerships benefit both the person who receives the analysis and the one doing the analysis on a campus. So thanks so much for your time today. We appreciate it. Appreciate getting to share this with you and appreciate the feedback. Take care and enjoy the conference.